The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Willa Voss was sitting on the floor of her St. Louis apartment, surrounded by 3 cardboard boxes and an eviction notice that had been slipped under the door sometime before dawn. She had not opened the notice. She already knew what it said. The letter from Cormac Finch, attorney at law, Calhoun County, Illinois, was printed on cream-colored paper that felt heavier than anything else she owned. It informed her that her grandmother, Hazel Voss, had passed on March 4th, and that she had been named the sole heir to a parcel of land and structures located at the end of Dillard Road, 14 miles outside the town of Gracie Falls. Willa had not spoken to her grandmother in 6 years. She read the letter twice. Then she looked at the eviction notice on the floor. Then she looked at the boxes. There are moments in a life when 2 things happen at exactly the same time, and you understand, even if you cannot explain it, that this was not an accident, that someone somewhere planned it this way. Willa Voss was 24 years old. She had $47 in her checking account, and she had just inherited 14 acres of land in a county she had not visited since she was a child. She put the letter in her back pocket, stood up, and started loading the boxes into her truck. Part 1. The Deed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Willa Voss was sitting on the floor of her St. Louis apartment, surrounded by 3 cardboard boxes and an eviction notice that had been slipped under the door sometime before dawn. She had not opened the notice. She already knew what it said. 3 months behind on rent. 60 days to vacate. The landlord had been patient in the way that people are patient when they have already decided the outcome and are simply waiting for the calendar to confirm it. The letter from Cormac Finch, attorney at law, Calhoun County, Illinois, was printed on cream-colored paper that felt heavier than anything else she owned at that moment. It informed her that her grandmother, Hazel Voss, had passed on March 4th, and that Willa had been named the sole heir to a parcel of land and structures located at the end of Dillard Road, 14 miles outside the town of Gracie Falls. Willa had not spoken to her grandmother in 6 years. She read the letter twice. Then she looked at the eviction notice on the floor. Then she looked at the 3 boxes. 2 of them held clothes. The third held everything else she owned that she considered worth keeping, which was not much. A sketchbook she hadn't opened in 8 months. A cast-iron skillet that had belonged to her mother. A photograph of herself at age 9 standing in a field she no longer remembered squinting into the sun, holding something she couldn't quite make out in the image anymore. She had kept that photograph because she looked happy in it. Not performed happy. Actually, happy. The kind of happy that doesn't know it's being recorded. There are moments in the life when 2 things happen at exactly the same time, and you understand, even if you cannot explain it, that this was not an accident. That someone, somewhere, planned it this way. Willa Voss was 24 years old. She had $47 in her checking account. She had just inherited 14 acres of land in a county she had not visited since childhood. She put the letter in her back pocket, stood up, and started loading the boxes into her truck. She drove northwest out of St. Louis on Route 67 with the windows down because the air conditioning had stopped working in May, and she had not had the money to fix it. The fields on either side of the highway came up slow, at first industrial, and flat, the kind of land that belongs to commerce rather than farming. But somewhere past Jerseyville, the character of the land changed. The rows got longer. The sky got wider. The light fell differently lower and more direct, the way it falls when there is nothing between you and the horizon to interrupt it. She had called Cormac Finch's office from a gas station parking lot outside Alton. His receptionist had given her directions to the property in a tone that was professionally neutral, but carried underneath it the faint texture of someone who had been briefed on the situation and had formed a private opinion. Cormac Finch himself met her at the end of Dillard Road in a tan sedan with a briefcase on the passenger seat and the look of a man who had delivered this kind of news before and had learned that less was more. He was somewhere in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of sunburn on his forearms that comes from working outdoors before switching to an office. He shook her hand firmly. He told her the basics as they stood beside their vehicles in the heat. 14 acres and 3/10. One farmhouse built in 1938, last occupied by Hazel Voss, up until 2 weeks before she passed. One secondary structure, a barn post and beam dating from the same era. One hand-dug well with a submersible pump installed in 2009. No mortgage, no liens. Property taxes current through the previous fiscal year. He paused after that last part the way people pause when they expect you to be surprised. Willa was surprised. She asked him how that was possible. He said that Hazel Voss had been what he called a deliberate woman. He said it the way you say something when you mean a great deal more than the words themselves contain. Then he handed her the keys and told her there was one thing Hazel had asked him to pass along. Not in writing, just a verbal instruction passed from Hazel to Cormac, and from Cormac to Willa, standing in the heat at the end of a gravel road in Calhoun County in the first week of June. He said her grandmother had been very specific about it. The barn first, not the house. The barn. Willa looked at him. He looked back at her with the careful expression of a man who knows more than he is saying and has decided that what he knows is not his to give. She took the keys and drove the last quarter-mile to the property alone. The farmhouse was white and leaning slightly east, as if it had spent 80 years listening for something in the fields and had tilted toward the sound. The paint was holding on more out of habit than intention. The porch sagged in the middle, but the railing was solid. A crow sat on the fence post at the edge of the yard and watched her park without moving. The barn stood behind the house, and to the left, its siding weathered to the color of old pewter. Both doors standing open, the way doors stand open in places where no one has been for a while. The tall grass had come up through the gravel path between the house and the barn. Seed heads brushed against her legs as she walked through it. She stopped at the threshold and let her eyes adjust. The interior was bigger than it looked from outside. 2 empty stalls along the left wall, their rails worn smooth from years of animal weight. A rusted cultivator against the far wall. Hand tools hung from wooden pegs above a workbench on the right side. Ropes coiled on the crossbeams. Light came in through gaps in the siding in thin white lines. And the dust inside those lines moved slowly, unhurried, the way dust moves in places that have not been disturbed. She stood in the middle of the floor and turned around once. That was when she saw it. Not a safe, not a locked chest. Nothing that announced itself as important. Just the workbench along the right wall, and on top of it, held flat by a mason jar filled with dried beans, a piece of oilcloth folded into a careful square. She crossed to it and lifted the mason jar away. The oilcloth had been folded and unfolded enough times that its creases had gone soft, like a road map kept in a glove box for 20 years. She unfolded it on the bench surface and smoothed it flat with both hands. It was a map, hand-drawn in pencil with some areas gone over in ink, the entire 14-acre parcel laid out in a way no county surveyor had ever bothered with. Every ridgeline marked, every low spot where water collected after rain indicated with a small curved line like a cup turned on its side. A dark patch near the center labeled clay firm with a small capital F. Another section along the eastern border labeled deep loam and underlined twice. And in the northeast corner, close to what had to be a seasonal drainage line, the word black written and then written again beneath it, as if once was not enough. 4 zones in total, each one mapped in terms of what it could do, not what it looked like, not what it was worth, what it could do. There was a note at the bottom written in the same forward-leaning hand Willa recognized from birthday cards received years ago before the silence between them had grown too wide to speak across. The land already knows what it wants. Your job is to ask the right questions. Willa stood at that workbench for a long time. Outside, a car passed on Dillard Road, and the sound of it moved through the fields and faded. Somewhere above her in the rafters, something small and feathered shifted its weight. The light through the siding gaps moved imperceptibly as the sun crossed. She refolded the oilcloth the way she had found it and tucked it carefully into the inside pocket of her jacket against her ribs. Then she walked back toward the farmhouse to find out what else had been left for her. The farmhouse interior was clean in the way that places become clean when someone has made deliberate peace with them before leaving. Not sterile, not abandoned, settled. The furniture was sparse and old and had the particular dignity of things that have been used honestly for a long time. A wooden table in the kitchen with 2 chairs. A cast-iron wood stove against the north wall with a stack of split oak beside it that would last well into winter. A single bookshelf in the front room holding field guides, a worn concordance, and 3 decades of seed catalogs organized by year. Willa moved through the rooms slowly. She found Hazel's reading chair by the east window positioned to catch the morning light. A pair of reading glasses rested on the arm. A library book sat on the side table with a receipt for a bookmark dated February 19th, 2 weeks before Hazel passed. She had been reading up until nearly the end. Willa stood by the chair and did not sit in it. In the kitchen, she opened the drawers one by one. Utensils, a flashlight with fresh batteries, rubber bands, matches in a waterproof tin, a folded county road map annotated in pencil, a roll of masking tape with a felt-tip pen tucked through it. In the third drawer, under a folded dish towel, a small brass key on a plain ring. She held it up. She didn't know what it opened. She set it on the table and kept looking. In the pantry, she found 3 months of canned goods organized by category: beans, tomatoes, corn, green beans. Each shelf labeled in masking tape and the same felt-tip pen from the drawer. The quantities were not random. This was a specific amount chosen by someone who had thought about it. She found the notebook under the kitchen floor. Not hidden exactly, or not hidden the way a secret is hidden. The third board from the south wall had a nail that had been pulled and not replaced. She noticed it when she was on her knees cleaning under the lower cabinet, a habit she had from living in rented rooms where the previous occupants' choices were never quite cleared away. She pressed the board. It lifted. The notebook was wrapped in wax paper tied with kitchen twine. She set it on the table and untied it carefully. The cover was plain brown cardboard reinforced at the corners with electrical tape. Inside, in small cramped block letters, Chester Voss, Soil Program, 1985 to 2001. Do not skip years. 16 years. Willa sat down at the kitchen table and opened to the first page. Chester Voss had not been a man of ceremony. The first entry, April 3rd, 1985, read simply, "Started east section today. 3 acres. Rye cover going in. pH at 5.8 too low. Plan to correct with oyster shell lime over 2 seasons slow application. Let's see what it wants to do." The handwriting was careful and slightly compressed. The writing of someone who was thinking faster than the pen could move and had learned to economize. Every entry was dated. Every variable was recorded. Soil temperature at planting, rainfall by month, what went in and what came out, what worked and what he adjusted the following season. April 14th, 1987. Second year lime application, east section. pH now 6.0, moving direction. Applied 40 pounds kelp meal per acre worked in lightly. Not tilling deep, don't want to invert layers. October 9th, 1988. Legume inoculant on the winter vetch again this year. 3rd season running. The nitrogen reading is moving, not fast, but moving. This is not the kind of work you rush. Willa turned pages slowly. The entries grew more specific as the years went on. By 1992, Chester was recording soil temperature at 2 depths 6 inches and 12 inches and cross-referencing it against germination timing for different crop families. By 1996, he was noting which seed varieties performed better in dry years versus wet ones, annotating the margins with small sketches of root systems, comments on stem thickness, observations about which plants set fruit earlier in cool springs. He was not farming by intuition alone. He was running a long experiment on 3 acres in Calhoun County, Illinois, and recording every result with the patience of someone who understood that the data would take years to mean anything. She turned to the entry dated October 31st, 2001. Ryland Marsh Sr. stopped by the property line again today. 4th time this year. His son Ryland was with him, staying by the truck, not coming to the fence. The father made his offer again. I said no again. He said the parcel was too small to matter to anyone, and that I was letting sentiment get in the way of good sense. I did not argue with him. I told him the land was not for sale and that I had reasons. He shook his head the way a man shakes his head when he has already decided you are a fool and is simply confirming it for himself. He drove away. His son looked back once before they cleared the tree line. I have been asked 4 times this year and 11 times in the last decade. I keep saying no for the same reason. This land is not about acreage. It is about what is possible on a small piece of ground when someone pays attention long enough. I want there to be a record of that. I want someone to find this book and understand that the work was real and the results were real, and that neither of those things happened by accident. This land is to prove something for whoever comes after. Willa sat with that page for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The afternoon light had moved and was coming through the west window, now long and amber, laying itself across the table in a warm diagonal. She could hear wind moving through the corn on the adjacent property. She could hear a truck pass on Dillard Road, slow down, and continue. She thought about her grandmother keeping this notebook for 23 years after Chester died, reading it, knowing what was in it, preparing a map that matched what he had documented, separating the two, deliberately hiding them in different places, ensuring that whoever came to claim this land would have to walk every corner of it before they understood what they had. She thought about the key in the 3rd drawer that she still hadn't identified. She thought about the $47 in her checking account and the eviction notice folded in her jacket pocket beside the oilcloth map. She closed the notebook, set it on the table beside the small brass key, and went outside to walk the property before the light was completely gone. The land was quiet in the way that working land goes quiet when it is resting between seasons. Not empty, resting. The difference is something you feel rather than see, a kind of stored pressure beneath the surface. The same way a field looks flat from the road, but tilts and hollows and rises when you are actually standing in it. Willa walked the eastern boundary first, following the fence line down toward the creek drainage, a seasonal watercourse marked on Hazel's map as a narrow line with small horizontal tick marks, the cartographic notation for intermittent flow. The creek bed was dry now, late summer, but the soil on either side of it was darker than the soil anywhere else on the property. Darker and looser, the kind of structure that holds its shape when you squeeze a handful, but breaks cleanly along natural lines instead of crumbling to powder. She crouched and picked up a handful. She turned it in her palm. She was not an agronomist. She had not studied soil science. What she knew about dirt was what she had read in the 3 weeks between receiving Finch's letter and arriving here, which was not much. But she had grown up making things with her hands, and she knew the feeling of good material. She knew the difference between something that would hold and something that would fall apart under pressure. This would hold. She followed the fence north to the corner of the property and stood there looking back across the length of the eastern section. The map had marked this area with symbols she now understood to mean high organic, moisture-retentive soil. Chester had noted it in the journal as the most responsive section of the parcel, the one that had shown the clearest improvement year over year throughout the years of his program. From the northeast corner, she could see the ridgeline at the north edge of the property, and below it, sheltered by a stand of old red cedar, a low earthen slope with what looked like a concrete collar half hidden in the grass. She noted it. She would come back to it. She walked the western line along the fence that bordered Harlow Briggs's property. There was no one visible on his land, but there was evidence of recent work, fresh tire tracks in the soft earth along the fence line, a new section of wire repair in the middle of the run, a coil of leftover galvanized still hanging from the post. Someone who paid attention to his fence. She walked back through the center of the property as the light went gold and flat, casting long shadows from the old cedar posts and turning the tall grass at the margins of the cultivated sections copper-colored in the late angle of the sun. The barn was visible from most of the property. The farmhouse behind it. The whole 14 acres contained enough to see in a single long view from the right position. She stopped in the middle of the parcel and turned 360 degrees. 14 acres. Everyone in Gracie Falls, she suspected, thought that was a punchline. A woman in her 20s with no farming experience. No capital, no plan showing up to claim a strip of ground that had been sitting untended for 2 seasons. She had already felt the quality of the attention on her from the moment she drove into town, that particular Midwestern surveillance that announces itself through things that are not said rather than things that are. The too long pause before answering a question. The careful way of saying nothing while meaning everything. She was not unaware of how this looked. She was also looking at the results of 16 years of quiet documented soil work and thinking about what it meant that nobody standing on Dillard Road looking at this parcel had ever known it was there. Ryland Marsh came on the 3rd day. She was in the barn when she heard the truck. She recognized the sound before she saw it, the particular engine note of a large late-model pickup driven by someone who expects roads to make way for them. She set down the length of fence wire she had been examining and walked to the barn door. The truck was a black F350 clean current model, pulling up the gravel drive at a pace that was not quite a stop and not quite a continuation. The man who stepped out was 66 years old, thick through the shoulders, wearing work clothes that were clean in a way that suggested they were for appearance rather than labor. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had owned things for a long time and had learned that patience was simply another form of leverage. He introduced himself at the edge of the drive, not coming past the invisible threshold of the yard, which Willa noticed. He said his name. He said he had known Hazel for 40 years, which was true in the way that certain statements are technically accurate without being exactly honest. He said he was sorry for her loss. He said if she needed anything at all during this transitional period, she should not hesitate. Willa thanked him. He looked at the barn. He looked at the fence line along the eastern edge. He looked at the house. None of these were casual glances. They were assessments. He said he understood she might be figuring out her situation, and that if at some point she wanted to talk about options for the property, he would be a reasonable person to talk to. He used the word reasonable twice in 3 sentences, which Willa noted. She said she was still getting oriented. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has heard that answer before and knows what it usually leads to. Then he mentioned, as if it had just occurred to him, that property taxes for the county's second filing period came due in late July, 6 weeks away. He said this with the tone of helpful information freely given. He said the previous owner had kept things current, which was admirable, but that things change, and it was good to be aware of timelines. He said he hoped she would feel welcome in Gracie Falls. He got back in his truck and drove out the same way he had come in. Willa stood in the drive for a moment after the sound of his engine had faded into the fields. Then she went back inside and found the county assessor's office number in the folded road map she had discovered in Hazel's kitchen drawer. The map had been annotated with small penciled notes in Hazel's hand, addresses and names, and a few phone numbers, all of them cross-referenced against dates she could not immediately interpret. She found the assessor's number and called it from the porch. The tax liability was $412. Due July 28th. She had $47. She sat on the porch step and did the arithmetic. Then she looked at the property. Then she looked at her phone and the balance in her checking account. Then she went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table with Chester's notebook and opened it to the section he had labeled Soil Program East Section Season 2. There was a way through this. She was not yet sure what it was. But someone had spent 16 years building something here, and someone else had spent the years after that protecting it and preparing it to be found. and they had done all of it in the same quiet, deliberate way that good work is always done, without announcement, without audience, without any guarantee that it would matter to anyone. It had mattered. She was sitting at the table in their kitchen, reading the record of it. She kept reading. On the fourth day, Delphine Oakes appeared. Willa was on her knees at the north end of the east section, pressing a soil probe into the ground at intervals of 6 feet, collecting samples into small labeled jars, the way Chester's notebook had described in the spring preparation entries when she heard a vehicle slow on the road and turn onto the drive. She straightened up. The woman who got out of the county extension office truck was somewhere in her late 50s, stout and deliberate in her movements, with the kind of handshake she delivered when Willa came to meet her that contained 20 years of outdoor work in its grip. She introduced herself as Delphine Oakes, Soil and Water Specialist, Calhoun County Extension. She said she had heard there was a new owner on the Voss parcel, and that she made a point of stopping by when properties changed hands to introduce herself and offer the county's resources. Willa thanked her. Delphine looked at the soil probe in Willa's hand. She looked at the labeled jars. She looked at the pattern of test points Willa had marked out with small flags along the eastern section. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You're sampling on a grid." Willa said she was trying to match the zones from a map she had found. Delphine looked at her with the particular expression of someone deciding how much to say. She said she could drop off a soil submission kit from the office the county ran tests at a subsidized rate for properties under 20 acres. She said results typically came back in 10 to 14 days. Willa said she would appreciate that. Delphine walked back to her truck and stopped at the door. She looked at the east section for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, something between professional neutrality and something older and more private. Then she got in the truck and left. Willa went back to her sampling. She was not sure what Delphine Oakes had been thinking, but she had the distinct impression that whatever it was not what she had said. Harlow Briggs came on the 5th day. He came on foot, which surprised her. She was clearing the drainage ditch along the north property line, working with a flat spade to move the accumulated silt that had been blocking the natural flow for what looked like 2 or 3 seasons when she looked up and saw him standing at the fence, watching. He was 62, lean in the way that outdoor men in their 60s are lean, the weight distributed evenly by decades of physical work. He wore a feed cap pulled low and had his hands resting on the top wire of the fence in a way that was neither aggressive nor casual, just present. He had the quality of someone who had spent a lifetime watching things and had learned to do it without embarrassment. He stood there for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You're going the wrong direction." Willa stopped and looked at him. He said the ditch ran southeast, not east. She was clearing the wrong end. The blockage was 20 feet down and to the right. He showed her with one hand a single gesture toward the correct section, then put his hand back on the wire. Willa moved to where he had indicated. She found the blockage immediately a packed accumulation of silt and decomposed reed material that had been redirecting the drainage into the adjacent field for what had to be 2 full seasons. She worked at it for 10 minutes while he watched. When she had it cleared and the water began moving again, she looked up. He nodded once. Then he walked back across his field without another word. She watched him go. That was the entirety of their first conversation, if it could be called a conversation. But she thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. About what it meant that a man who had watched this property for years had shown up on the 5th day, not the 1st, and had said the minimum necessary to be useful, and then left without asking for anything. She thought about what her grandmother's map had marked along the northern fence line. The word water written in pencil so faint she had almost missed it. She went back to the map that evening and studied the northern section again with the flashlight. The drainage ditch she had just cleared was part of a larger system that Hazel had marked with a series of small arrows indicating flow direction. The arrows converged on a point near the cedar stand.
On the north slope, the same low concrete collar she had noticed on her first walk of the property.
She had still not gone to look at it closely. She told herself it could wait until tomorrow. She wasn't sure she believed it. On the morning of the 6th day, Willa drove the 14 miles into Gracie Falls to take the soil samples to the extension office. She carried them in the kit. Delphine Oakes had dropped off 4 small jars labeled with masking tape and the felt-tip pen from Hazel's kitchen drawer, because she still did not have her own supplies and was not ready to admit how completely she was operating off what her grandmother had left behind. The town of Gracie Falls was the kind of place that had contracted slowly around its own center, the way small agricultural towns do when the economics shift and don't shift back. Main Street had a hardware store, a diner, a farm co-op, an insurance office, and 3 empty storefronts with paper in the windows. The grain elevator at the north end of town was the tallest structure for 5 miles and the most recently painted. She dropped the samples at the extension office window. The woman behind the counter was not Delphine Oakes. She was younger, and she looked at the jars, and then at Willa, and then at the jars again, with the particular assessment of someone cataloging information they intend to discuss later. She said 10 to 14 business days. Willa thanked her. On the way out, she passed the Beaumont Farm Supply on the corner of Main and County Road 9. 3 men standing outside, 2 older, 1 middle-aged, the kind of gathering that forms in front of supply stores in small towns every morning. Because the supply store is where you stand when you want to know what is happening without having to ask. One of them was Ryland Marsh. He was not looking at her. He was looking at something down the street holding a coffee cup. His body turned 45 degrees away from the direction she was walking. But when she passed, she felt the shift in the group's attention, the way you feel a change in air pressure. Nothing said, nothing gestured. Just the fact of being observed and filed. She got in her truck and drove back on Dillard Road. Ryland came back on the afternoon of the 12th day. He came with a different truck. His own black F350 was followed by a silver Suburban that she did not recognize. The man who got out of the Suburban was carrying a clipboard. and wore a shirt with a company logo she couldn't read from the distance of the porch. Ryland introduced the man as a regional property assessor. He said with the same tone he used for everything that he was helping compile updated valuation records for properties in the rural sections of the county. Standard practice, nothing to be concerned about. The man with the clipboard walked the fence line along the south and east sections, making notes, occasionally stopping to photograph the soil or the drainage system or the access road. He did not ask Willa's permission. He did not look at her. Willa stood on the porch and watched. When they were at the northeast corner, Ryland's eyes moved to the cedar stand at the north ridge. He stood very still for a moment, the coffee cup in his hand, looking at the low earthen slope and the concrete collar at its base. Then he looked back at Willa on the porch. He raised his coffee cup in a slight acknowledgement. Neighborly, unhurried. The gesture of a man who is doing arithmetic in his head and is satisfied with the result. The Suburban left first. Ryland lingered at his truck for a moment, then crossed the yard to the porch steps. He stood at the base and looked up at her. He said he wanted her to know that his offer was a serious one, and that he hoped she would treat it as such. He said that 14 acres was a meaningful parcel in this part of the county, and that he had a genuine interest in seeing it managed well one way or another. He said he had put a number in writing. He reached into his jacket and set an envelope on the porch railing. He said, $52,000. Cash settlement, no contingencies. You'd have no more tax liability, no maintenance overhead, and you'd walk away with enough to start somewhere else. I think that's fair, given what you're working with here. Then he said, tax deadline is 6 weeks out. I understand that creates a certain pressure. I don't mean to add to it. I just want you to know the option is there. He left the envelope on the railing and walked back to his truck. Willa did not watch him drive away. She was looking at the envelope. She picked it up. She took it inside. She set it on the kitchen table next to Chester's notebook and the small brass key she still had not found the lock for, and the oilcloth map she had brought back inside and unfolded again that morning, lying flat and waited at its corners with a coffee cup, a jar of dried beans, the flashlight, and the county road map. $52,000. She sat down and opened Chester's notebook to the entry from October 31st, 2001. She read the last paragraph again, the one about what the land was for. Then she turned to the next page, which she had not read yet because she had stopped at the October entry and not continued. She turned the page. November 14th, 2001. Sent soil samples today from all 4 sections, using the grid map Hazel drew last spring. Her map is better than mine would have been. She sees the land differently than I do. I see what it can produce. She sees what it remembers. I think you need both. One more thing. I taped a page at the back of this book. Don't open it yet. Open it when you've earned it. You'll know when that is. Willa looked at the back of the notebook. She had not noticed it before, because she had been reading from the front. But there it was. The last page adhered to the inside back cover with a strip of yellowed tape sealed in a way that was deliberate and patient, the way all of this had been deliberate and patient. She pressed her fingers against it. She did not open it. She closed the notebook and set it on the table. Outside the kitchen window, the fields were moving in the evening wind, long and slow, the way fields move when the light is going and the day is ending, and all the work that was done and not done settles back into the ground to wait for morning. She looked at the envelope from Ryland Marsh. She looked at the notebook. She looked at the map. Then she got up, found Hazel's masking tape and felt-tip pen in the kitchen drawer, and labeled the envelope with a single word in Hazel's own handwriting. Style, block letters, careful and forward-leaning. She wrote, "Not yet." She put it in the third drawer under a dish towel next to the small brass key, and she went out to walk the north ridge before the light was completely gone. She needed to see what was at the top of that slope. She had been waiting long enough. Part 2. The dry season. The rain stopped on June 14th. Not dramatically, not with a final hard storm that cleared the air and left the fields smelling of wet earth and new possibility. It simply stopped the way ordinary things stop, without ceremony, without announcement. And by the time Willa understood that it had stopped for a long time, 7 days had passed, and the ground along the south section had already begun to show the first thin cracks along its surface. Hairline fractures running parallel to the old cultivar rows, like something written in a language she was still learning to read. She had been on the property for 3 weeks by then. In those 3 weeks, she had done the following things. She had cleared the drainage ditch along the north line. She had patched 40 feet of fence wire along the eastern boundary using the old galvanized coils she found in the barn, stiff as rebar and difficult to work but solid once set. She had swept and mopped the farmhouse floor twice because the first time had simply redistributed the dust rather than removed it. She had read Chester's notebook through to the entry dated March 9th, 2001, which was the second to last entry before the sealed page at the back, stopping there each time because she was not ready, and she knew she was not ready. She had eaten most of Hazel's canned goods and driven twice to the grocery in Harwick because Gracie Falls did not have one, and she had spent money she did not have on seeds and soil amendment supplies because she had looked at Chester's 16-year record and understood that the only way to honor it was to continue it. She had ordered the seeds on a Thursday, sitting at the kitchen table with Chester's notebook open beside her laptop, cross-referencing his variety notes with current supplier catalogs. She ordered from 2 sources. Mortgage Lifter Tomatoes, which Chester had mentioned twice in the 1994 entries as the most reliable performer in hot, dry summers. Dragon Tongue Beans, which Hazel had added to the margin of Chester's 1997 entry in her own handwriting with a single annotation these. A dry corn variety called Bloody Butcher that Chester had grown in the late 80s and then stopped growing, the reason noted in the journal, as Marsh Sr. complained about cross-pollination, which Willa read and then read again and then added to the order without deliberating further. 6 varieties of winter squash. The total came to slightly more than she had, and she covered it with the last available credit on a card she had been carrying since her second year of college. She did not allow herself to calculate the remaining balance. What she understood, standing at the edge of the property on June 14th, watching the last gray clouds move east without releasing anything, was that she had planted herself into a situation from which there was now no comfortable exit. The seeds were ordered. Some were already started in the cold frames she had built from salvage lumber, and 3 old storm windows she had found stacked behind the smokehouse under a canvas tarp. The soil prep was underway. The tax deadline was 5 weeks away, and it had stopped raining. She went to the North Ridge that evening. She had gone the first time 6 days ago, the evening after Ryland left his envelope on the porch railing. She had walked up the slope through the cedar stand in the last of the light and stood in front of the concrete collar and looked at it for a long time without doing anything. It was approximately 4 feet in diameter, set flush with the ground, with a cast iron cap bolted over the opening. The cap had a lifting ring that had rusted into a reddish oval, still functional but stiff. Around the base of the collar, the ground was faintly lower than the surrounding area, a slight depression that Willa had initially read as erosion, but now understood as settlement, the kind that happens when something substantial sits in the earth for 50 years. She had come back twice since then, and each time had stood looking at it without opening it, not because she was afraid of what was inside, but because she understood in the way she was beginning to understand things about this property, that timing mattered, that the act of opening something was different from the act of finding it, and that the difference had consequences. On the evening of June 14th, she brought tools, a length of rebar from the barn to use as a lever, a flashlight with fresh batteries from Hazel's kitchen drawer, the schematics from Hazel's kitchen cabinet door, the diagram she had found 3 days after arriving, tucked flat against the interior panel of the upper cabinet above the refrigerator, in a way that would have been completely invisible unless you removed everything from the shelf and looked at the cabinet itself rather than its contents. The diagram was hand-drawn on the back of a 1974 seed order receipt, Hazel's handwriting in the margins. Measurements in feet, pipe diameters in inches, a gravity-fed line running from the base of the structure down the north slope and branching toward the lower beds in a Y configuration. Valve positions numbered 1 through 4. And at the top of the page written above, the drawing in a hand that was slightly different from the rest, slightly more careful, as if she had thought about it before writing, for the years when the sky forgets us. Below the technical diagram, a date. Construction completed October 1974. Hazel had built this the autumn after the drought of 1973 took the corn crop and nearly took the farm. She had built it alone or close to alone. The diagram showed a structure that one person with the right knowledge and enough time could have executed without outside help. 8 feet deep, 6 feet in diameter, poured concrete walls and floor. An inlet pipe from the seasonal drainage line on the north slope, filtered through a gravel bed, a sealed cap to prevent evaporation and contamination. According to the diagram, at full capacity, it held approximately 12,000 gallons. She had not told anyone it was there. The diagram had been hidden in a place where only someone who lived in the house and knew to look for it would ever find it. Willa thought about Chester's notebook entry from November 2001, the one where he had written that Hazel saw the land differently, that she saw what it remembered. She thought he knew about the cistern eventually. He had to have, but he had respected the fact that it was hers to tell. She set the rebar under the edge of the cap and leaned her weight against it. The bolt mechanism was stiff from years of disuse, but it had been designed for exactly this kind of moment for the year, when the sky forgot for the granddaughter with the rebar and the flashlight and the dying credit card balance and the seeds in the ground. It turned, slowly with resistance, and then with a deep mechanical click as the locking mechanism released. She lifted the cap. She pointed the flashlight down. The cistern was not empty. The water surface was approximately 3 feet below the top of the collar, dark, and still reflecting the beam of the flashlight back at her in a single unwavering point. She estimated it at 60 to 70% capacity. The March rains had done their work. The inlet screen was partially blocked with leaf debris, which explained why it had not filled completely. But the water that was there was there. Because the drainage system Hazel had engineered in 1974 had continued functioning without maintenance, without anyone knowing it was functioning for 50 years. Willa sat back on her heels and pointed the flashlight at the sky. The sky was clear, dry and clear, the way Illinois skies get in early summer, when the pressure systems stall and the corn in the big fields to the west starts to look just slightly less green than it should. She had water. She had 12,000 gallons at 70% capacity in a structure that Ryland Marsh had been looking for. She now understood every time his eyes moved to the cedar stand at the North Ridge. He had suspected it was there. His father had probably suspected it was there for 30 years. That was part of what the 14 acres was worth to them. Part of what Chester's water rights victory in 1991 had failed to fully account for. The surface rights and the documented subterranean access were one thing. A functioning private cistern fed by the north drainage line was another thing entirely. She replaced the cap carefully. She did not lock it back. She would need to access it again soon. She walked back down the slope through the cedars in the dark, feeling her way between the trunks by memory. And by the time she reached the edge of the cleared ground, the plan had mostly assembled itself in her head, the way plans do, when you have been thinking around the edges of something for long enough that the center finally becomes obvious. She needed to get the cistern fully operational in the next week, clean the inlet screen, check the valve sequence against Hazel's diagram, trace the gravity-fed lines down the slope to the lower beds, and assess what condition the pipe joints were in after 50 years. Order replacement parts for anything that had deteriorated. She would need $94, she calculated, for parts and connectors based on the specifications in the diagram. She had $94. She checked twice to be sure. She went inside and made a list. The soil test results came back 11 days into the dry stretch. Delphine Oakes called at 7:40 in the morning, which told Willa something before the conversation even started. Extension office specialists did not call at 7:40 in the morning for routine results. They mailed them, or they had the desk assistant call during office hours, or they attached a form to an email with a brief note of interpretation. Delphine called herself. Before 8 in the morning, Willa was outside checking the cold frames when the phone rang. She pulled off her work gloves and answered it standing in the dew-wet grass at the edge of the north beds. Delphine said she had the results from the Voss parcel samples. She said she wanted to call rather than mail them because she thought Willa would want to know right away. She said the organic matter reading from the east section was 4.7%. She said the pH was 6.1 across all 4 sample sites, within 1/10 of a point in every case, which was the most consistent multi-site reading she had seen in Calhoun County in her 22 years with the Extension Office. She said the East Section results were the highest organic matter readings in the county's documented testing history since 1993. When the Extension Office had begun its current standardized protocol. She said all of this in the measured, careful tone of a professional who has learned to deliver surprising information without editorializing. But underneath the professional tone, there was something else, a quality of attention, the way a voice changes when a person is saying something they have been waiting to say for longer than the current conversation. Willa sat down on the cold frame lid. She did not say anything for a moment. Delphine said, whoever worked that east section knew what they were doing, and they did it for a long time. Willa said 16 years. He kept a notebook. There was a pause on the line. Delphine said, I'd like to see that notebook someday if you're willing. Willa said she thought that could be arranged. She thanked Delphine and set the phone down in the grass beside her and looked out at the east section. The beds she had prepped were still bare in most places. The cold frame starts too young yet for transplant, the direct seeded areas just beginning to show the first thread-thin green lines of emergence along the rows. 4.7% organic matter. Chester had started at 5.8 pH and inadequate structure in 1985. He had ended at what those numbers implied the highest recorded result in the county's modern testing history. Through 16 years of kelp meal and cover crops and inoculant on every legume seed, and no synthetic nitrogen after the 3rd year. Because as he had written in a 1991 entry that Willa had read 4 times, it burns what you're trying to build. He had been gone 23 years. He was still working. She got up, put her gloves back on, and went to check the cold frame temperatures for the morning. She spent 5 days on the cistern. The inlet screen came out in pieces degraded by decades of exposure to the organic load in the drainage water, and she replaced it with a double-layer stainless mesh she ordered from a plumbing supplier in Alton that arrived in 3 days. The valve bodies were original cast iron, 2 of the 4 still functional ones seized and 1 cracked at the collar. She ordered replacements. The gravity-fed lines down the slope were PVC, which had held better than she expected, with 3 joints that had separated at the couplings and needed resetting with new connectors and sealant. Total cost $91. She had $3 left in her account when the last part arrived. On the 5th day, she opened valve 1, which fed the upper bed line on the east section, according to the numbered diagram in Hazel's schematic. The water moved. Not fast. Gravity-fed systems don't rush. They move with the unhurried authority of things operating according to natural law, following grade, and pressure differential, indifferent to urgency. The water came through the upper line, found the distribution head she had connected at the top of the east section, and spread into the lateral runs she had laid along the bed edges. She stood at the bottom of the section and watched the soil at the end of the lateral line darken as the water reached it. She heard boots on the gravel behind her. Harlow Briggs had come through the gate in the fence line, the one she had not known was there until 3 days ago, when she had noticed the latch hardware on her side and understood it had been installed by someone who expected to use it from the other direction. He walked to the edge of the east section and stood beside her and watched the water moving through the lines. He looked at the cistern valve head at the top of the slope. He looked at the distribution system she had built. He looked at the lateral lines along the bed edges and the darkening soil at the far end. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Hazel had a cistern up there. I always figured she did, but she never showed me where. Willa said she showed me, in her own way." He looked at the water for another moment. Then he turned and walked back through the gate. He came back 7 minutes later, carrying a 50-pound bag of composted poultry amendment on one shoulder, the good commercial grade, the kind that cost $30 at the farm co-op. He set it down at the edge of the first bed without a word and went back through the gate. She heard his truck start on the other side of the fence. She looked at the bag. She looked at the water moving through her lines. She went and got Chester's notebook from the kitchen and sat at the edge of the east section in the sun and kept reading. On a Thursday morning, 9 days before the tax deadline, Ryland Marsh appeared on the property without announcement. He came with the same silver Suburban she had seen on the 12th day, and the same man with the clipboard, and this time a third person. She did not recognize a woman in a blazer who carried a folder and kept looking at her phone. They parked at the end of the drive and walked the fence line along the south edge, and Willa watched from the porch as they moved slowly along the property boundary. The clipboard man stopping to photograph the soil profile where she had recently turned a test strip, the woman in the blazer writing something in the folder. Ryland did not come to the porch this time. He stood at the eastern fence corner and looked at the north ridge for a long time, long enough that Willa set down her coffee and walked out to the fence line herself. She asked what they were doing. Ryland said it was a follow-up assessment for the county records. Routine. She said she had not been notified. He said notification was not always required for external assessments on adjacent properties. She said they were standing inside her property line. He looked at the ground, then at the fence as if recalculating. Then he smiled the smile of a man who has made an error and found it unimportant and stepped back to the other side of the fence wire without apology. The woman in the blazer was looking at her phone. The clipboard man was taking a photograph of the North Ridge tree line of the cedar stand of the low earthen slope where the cistern sat beneath its cast iron cap. Willa said clearly and without heat, "I'd like all three of you to move back to the road." Ryland looked at her. She looked back at him. He nodded once to the others. They walked back to the road without hurrying the way people walk when they want to suggest that the direction they are going was already their intention. Ryland stopped at the end of the drive. He said, "The offer is still open. I want to make sure you know that." Willa said, "I know." He said tax deadline is 9 days out. The offer simplifies a complicated situation. She said, "I understand the deadline." He looked past her at the North Ridge one more time. Then he said, with a directness that was new, stripped of the neighborly overlay he had been using, "That cistern up there. If it's functional, it changes things. For you, and for the value conversation." Willa said nothing. He said Hazel was a careful woman. If she built something on that north slope, it would be worth understanding what rights attached to it. Structurally, legally. I'm just saying it would be worth understanding. He got into the F350 and drove away. Willa stood at the end of the drive for a moment after the dust settled. The Suburban had already gone. A meadowlark was calling from the fence post at the eastern corner. The same post it called from every morning, indifferent to the conversation that had just taken place beside it. She went inside and opened the county assessor's website on her laptop. She typed in the parcel number from the deed documents. She pulled up the full property record. Under supplemental structures, the cistern was not listed, which meant either Hazel had never disclosed it, which was her right under the property's construction date and the disclosure requirements of 1974, or the county's records were simply incomplete, which was also possible. Either way, it was not in the official record. And if it was not in the official record, then its existence was, legally speaking, something that only the current property owner and anyone she chose to inform was aware of. She thought about the way Ryland had looked at the cedar stand every single time he had been on the property. She thought about what Delphine Oakes had said about organic matter, about the east section's soil being built over 16 years by someone who had documented every variable. She thought about Chester's water rights victory in 1991, the one she did not yet fully understand, the one she had not yet gone to look up, the one that an anonymous message on her phone was about to direct her toward. That message came 4 days later. It came at 11:17 p.m. on a Monday while she was sitting on the porch in the dark, listening to the insects in the fields and thinking about the tax payment that was 5 days away and the $3 in her checking account. The number was a Calhoun County area code she did not recognize. The message contained 11 words. Check county deed records. 1991. Voss versus Marsh. That was all. She read it 3 times. She looked at the number. She did not recognize it. She saved the message and set the phone on the porch railing and looked out at the fields for a long time. Then she went inside, set her alarm for 7:30, and went to sleep. She was going to the county records office in the morning. She went to the extension office first, not because she had planned to, but because Delphine Oakes's truck was in the parking lot when she drove past. And something that had been forming in the back of her mind for the past 2 weeks crystallized into a specific question she needed to ask before she looked at anything in the county records. Delphine was at her desk. She looked up when Willa appeared in the doorway with an expression that was professionally neutral and contained within it somewhere the quality of someone who had been expecting this visit. Willa sat down across from her. She said, "Someone sent me an anonymous message last night. They told me to look at the 1991 deed records. Voss versus Marsh." Delphine looked at her steadily. Willa said, "I'm not asking you to confirm or deny anything. I just want to know if there's something I need to understand before I walk into that records office." Delphine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The county extension office has documented water table readings for this part of Calhoun County going back to 1978. The Eastern Aquifer Recharge Zone that feeds the subterranean water table under this section of the county has a primary access corridor that runs along the eastern boundary of your property," she said. "That's public information. It's in the extension records. Anyone can look it up." She said the 1991 legal proceeding created a recorded easement and usage right tied to that corridor. The right runs with the land, which means it transferred with the deed when you inherited the property. She said all of this looking directly at Willa, her hands flat on the desk, her voice even and professional. Willa said, "How long have you known this?" Delphine said, "Long enough to know that Hazel knew it too." Willa thanked her and stood up. At the door, she stopped. She said, "The text message. Was that you?" Delphine looked at her paper calendar on the desk. She turned 1 page forward and 1 page back. She said, "My office hours are Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30. If you have follow-up questions about the soil results, you're welcome to stop in anytime." Willa nodded. She walked out to her truck and sat for a moment in the parking lot with both hands on the wheel. Then she drove to the county records office 4 blocks north and went inside to read the file from 1991. The truth about what the ground had been keeping was waiting for her there. She had been waiting for it longer than she knew. Part 3. What the ground keeps. The county records office smelled like paper and cold air conditioning, and the particular stillness of places where the past is stored in physical form, organized by year and parcel number, and the dry, bureaucratic language that outlasts everyone it describes. The clerk was a man in his mid-50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the careful movements of someone who had spent decades handling documents that other people found urgent. Willa gave him the case reference she had pulled from the anonymous message, adding what Delphine had told her about the year and the parties. He went to the back without comment and returned with a manila folder that was thicker than she had expected, bound with a rubber band that had dried and stiffened over 30 years into something more like a strip of dark plastic than anything elastic. He set it on the counter and went back to his desk. She carried it to the reading table by the window. The folder contained 41 pages. She read all of them. Chester Voss had filed the initial complaint in March of 1991 against Beaumont Marsh Sr., doing business as Marsh Agricultural Holdings, alleging unlawful interference with established water access rights along the eastern boundary of the Voss parcel, specifically the subterranean recharge corridor that fed the seasonal drainage line and the groundwater table beneath the eastern section of his property. The complaint was precise and detailed in the way that complaints are precise and detailed when they have been prepared by someone who has been watching and documenting for a long time before deciding to act. Attached to the complaint were 16 pages of Chester's own records, soil moisture readings by season going back to 1985. Water table measurements taken at the eastern boundary at 2-month intervals. A detailed timeline of incidents in which Marsh Sr.'s drainage modifications on the adjacent eastern property had demonstrably reduced the water flow into the Voss parcel's recharge zone. Photographs, dates, quantities. Chester had been keeping this record in parallel with his soil program notebook, a second 16-year document that Willa had not found because it was not in the house or the barn. It was here. Filed in the Calhoun County Records Office in 1991, entered into evidence and sealed into the public record where it had been sitting for 33 years. Marsh Sr. had contested the complaint for 7 months. The county court had ruled in Chester's favor in October 1991, establishing a recorded conservation easement and priority water access right tied to the eastern boundary of the Voss parcel. The right was permanent. It ran with the land. It had transferred to Hazel when Chester died, and it had transferred to Willa 4 months ago when Hazel passed as automatically and legally as the deed itself. The right guaranteed Willa's access to the eastern aquifer recharge corridor and prohibited any upstream modification of the drainage system that would materially reduce water flow into the Voss parcel's eastern boundary. What the ruling also meant, and what Willa understood only when she read the technical appendix attached to the judgment, was that Ryland Marsh's 420 acres on the eastern side of her property depended on that same aquifer corridor during drought years. His eastern fields, the ones he irrigated from a well system installed in 2003, drew from the same subterranean source. The priority right Chester had established in 1991 meant that in any year of shortage, Willa's access was legally senior to Marsh's. In a dry year, whoever held the Voss parcel held the upstream position. And it had not rained in 22 days. She sat at the reading table for a long time after she finished the last page. Through the window, she could see a section of Main Street, a truck pulling into the farm co-op, a woman walking a dog on the opposite sidewalk, the grain elevator at the north end of town standing against a sky that was still clear and dry and entirely indifferent to what she had just read. She thought about Ryland Marsh standing at her fence line looking at the cedar stand. She thought about the assessor he had brought the photographs they had taken of the North Ridge. She thought about the way his voice had changed when he mentioned the cistern, the directness that had come through the neighborly overlay like a frame showing through old paint. He had known about the 1991 ruling. He had grown up knowing about it. His father had lost a court case over this parcel when Ryland was 33 years old, and Ryland had spent the following 3 decades waiting for a moment when the Voss side of the fence was weak enough to resolve the situation a different way. She thought about Hazel living alone on this property for 23 years after Chester died, fielding offers from the Marsh family, with the same quiet refusals Chester had given, maintaining the water rights and the soil program and the cistern and the annotated maps and the sealed notebook page, building a case not for a courtroom, but for a granddaughter she had not spoken to in 6 years and had bet everything on anyway. She thought about the word deliberate, the way Cormac Finch had used it standing in the heat at the end of Dillard Road. She gathered the pages, returned them to the folder, and handed it back to the clerk. She thanked him. She walked out into the dry June heat and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then she got in her truck and drove to Ryland Marsh's office. His operation was headquartered 3 miles east of Gracie Falls, on a property that announced its scale immediately: a long gravel lane lined with mature oaks, a main house set well back from the road, a cluster of equipment buildings behind it, a grain storage complex visible from the highway. The land around it was green, but strained the soybeans in the near fields, showing the pale, slightly yellowish cast that comes in the 3rd week without rain, the color of a crop that is managing but not thriving. His fields were dry. She pulled up to the main building, which served as his farm office, and went inside without calling ahead. The woman at the front desk looked at her with the expression of someone who recognized her without knowing her name and said she would check if Mr. Marsh was available. Ryland appeared in the inner doorway less than 2 minutes later, which told her he had been expecting this visit, if not today, then sometime this week. He looked at her with an expression that had reorganized itself from the version he wore at her fence line. This one was more careful, more contained. He invited her in. He closed the door. His office was the office of a man who wanted visitors to understand that he was serious. A large desk, current aerial photographs of his acreage on the wall, annotated with field numbers and crop rotations, a county map behind him with his property boundary marked in red. The Voss parcel was on that map, outlined but unmarked, the way you might leave a piece of a puzzle out of the frame to indicate that it is still in play. She set the folder on his desk. Not her copy. She had requested a photocopy from the clerk before leaving, using $4 in quarters from the coin dish on the counter, her last $4, and left the original in the file where it belonged. She set the photocopy on his desk and did not sit down. She said, "I spent this morning at the county records office." He looked at the folder. He did not open it. He said, "I know what's in there." She said, "Then you know that the water access right is mine. Senior priority. Established 1991. It transfers with the deed." He said, "I know what the ruling says." She said, "Your eastern fields are drawing from the same aquifer. In a dry year, my priority is legal and enforceable." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "It's been a dry stretch. Could still turn." She said it could. "But you brought an assessor onto my property twice to look at the North Ridge. You knew about the cistern. You knew what the cistern access means in combination with the water right." He said nothing. She said, You've been trying to buy this land for the same reason your father tried to buy it. It's not the acreage." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Something closer to genuine appraisal than the studied neighborliness he had been deploying since the first day. He said, "Your grandfather was a stubborn man." She said, "He was a thorough man." "There's a difference." He said, 14 acres is a hard thing to build a life on." She said, "Chester built something on 3 acres that is still working 23 years after he died." Hazel kept a cistern running for 50 years without telling anyone where it was. "I think the scale is a matter of perspective." He was quiet. She said, "I'm not here to threaten anything. The water right sits in the public record. It will be there whether we have this conversation or not. I came here because I thought you should know that I've read the file, that I understand what the parcel is, and that I'm not going to sell it." She picked up her truck keys from where she had set them on the edge of his desk. She said, "If there's ever a dry year bad enough that your eastern wells are in trouble, I'd rather be a neighbor who talks to you than a legal filing you weren't expecting." "But that's your decision to make." She walked to the door. He said behind her, "You're your grandmother's girl." She stopped. She did not turn around. She said, "She counted on that." She walked out through the front office and got in her truck and drove back to Dillard Road. The tax payment was due in 4 days. She had $3 and some change in her account, and a property that she now understood in a way she had not understood it a week ago, and a set of cold frames full of seedlings, and a cistern at 60% capacity, and a water right recorded in the county courthouse since 1991, and no liquid means of keeping any of it. She sat at the kitchen table that evening with Chester's notebook and Hazel's map, and the photocopy of the 1991 filing, and the small brass key that she had still not identified. And she laid them all out on the table and looked at them the way you look at a hand of cards when you are trying to understand what game you are actually playing. The key had been bothering her since the first week. It was small brass, the kind of key cut for a simple lock, not a padlock, something interior. She had tried it in every lock in the farmhouse over the past 3 weeks. The front door, the back door, the smokehouse, every kitchen cabinet, the cellar door, which used a different key she had found on the ring from Cormac Finch. None of them. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers. She thought about the way Hazel had organized everything. The map in the barn, the notebook under the floor, the cistern diagram inside the cabinet door. Each thing hidden in a place that required a specific kind of attention to find. Not locked away, present but patient, waiting for someone who was paying the right kind of attention. She looked at the bookshelf in the front room. She had looked at the books in the first week, but had not looked at the shelf itself. She walked to it now, 3 decades of seed catalogs organized by year. Field guides, the worn concordance. She pulled the concordance from the shelf. It was heavier than it should have been. The pages had been cut. Not all of them a section in the middle 2 inches deep, forming a rectangular cavity in the body of the book. Inside the cavity, a small metal box, the kind sold at office supply stores for storing index cards, with a simple hinged lid and a lock on the front. She put the brass key in the lock. It turned. Inside the box were 3 things. An envelope sealed with her name written on the front in Hazel's handwriting. A savings account passbook from the Calhoun County Savings Bank. The old paper kind, the kind they had stopped issuing 20 years ago. And a folded piece of paper with the bank's current letterhead and a handwritten account number with a note that said transferred to current account. Ask for Marion at the front desk she knows. She opened the passbook first. It recorded deposits made twice a year, April and October, from 1978 through 2019. 41 years of entries, each one between $200 and $800, occasionally more in good years. The kind of savings that don't announce themselves. The kind that accumulate the way soil organic matter accumulates slowly, consistently, without anyone watching over a period of time long enough that the result surprises even the person doing the arithmetic. She did the arithmetic. The total deposits over 41 years came to just over $31,000. She opened the folded paper with the current account number. The transferred balance updated to the date of Hazel's death was $18,400. Interest over the years, some withdrawals, she could not account for the net result of 4 decades of quiet, deliberate saving. She sat with that for a long time. Then she opened the sealed envelope. Hazel's handwriting unhurried the forward-leaning capitals she recognized from birthday cards and the map in the barn and the note at the bottom of Chester's diagram. It said, "The account is yours. Use what you need for the taxes first. What's left is for the season." I always found that April and October were the moments that determined everything. Pay attention to those 2 months, and the rest of the year will follow. The bank will know you're coming. I told Marion about you. I told her you'd be stubborn about it, which I mean as a compliment. The land is not a gift. It is an argument I've been making for 50 years. You're the conclusion. Don't thank me. Just stay. Hazel. Willa set the letter flat on the table and pressed her palms against it. Outside the kitchen window, the fields were dark and still. The cistern was holding on the north ridge. The cold frames were holding along the east section. The seedlings inside them were a week from transplant, strong from the slow hardening process she had been running them through 10 minutes outside, then 20, then an hour, then 2. The way you teach anything to bear what it will eventually have to bear. She stayed at the table for a long time. Then she drove to the Calhoun County Savings Bank in the morning and asked for Marion. Marion was 71 and had worked at the bank for 44 years and had known Hazel Voss for most of them. She shook Willa's hand with both of hers and said she was glad to finally put a face to the name, and the way she said finally suggested that she and Hazel had discussed this moment in some detail. She transferred the account into Willa's name in 20 minutes. She printed the current balance on a slip of paper and folded it once and handed it across the counter. Willa opened it. The balance was $18,400 and some cents. She paid the property tax that afternoon, $412. She had $17,988 remaining. She drove back to the farm and sat in the truck at the end of the drive for a moment before going in. $18,000 was not a fortune. In agricultural terms, it was a single season's operating budget for a very small operation, and that was if everything went right, and nothing ever went entirely right in the first season. But it was real. It was documented. It had been built over 4 decades by a woman who had understood that the ground you stand on is only as secure as the preparation underneath it, and that preparation was a thing you did in the good years so that you had something in the bad ones. She went inside and started transplanting tomatoes the next morning. The dry stretch broke on July 3rd. Not violently, not with the thunderstorm drama that everyone in Gracie Falls had been predicting and hoping for, and quietly disbelieving in for 3 weeks. It broke the way Illinois summers sometimes break with a slow overnight system that came in from the northwest after midnight and laid a steady soaking rain across the county for 11 hours. Willa woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of it on the farmhouse roof and lay still for a long time listening. By morning, the fields were dark, and the creek bed at the eastern boundary had water moving in it for the first time since mid-June, and the soil in the east section, which had been drawing from the cistern every other day through the worst of the dry stretch, absorbed the rain with the particular readiness of ground that has good structure, pulling the water in and holding it rather than letting it sheet off the surface the way compacted or depleted soil does. She stood at the edge of the east section in the rain and watched it. The tomatoes had been in the ground for 11 days. The dragon-tongue beans were 6 inches tall. The winter squash had set its first true leaves. The bloody butcher corn in the south corner was knee-high and climbing. The rain fell on all of it. She stayed outside until she was soaked through and then went in and made coffee and called her mother. She had not called since February. That was 5 months. Her mother answered on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting the way mothers wait when they have decided to be patient. Her mother asked if she was all right. Willa looked out the kitchen window at the rain on the east section, at the tomato rows and the bean rows and the corn in the south corner, and the cistern on the north ridge that had carried her through 3 weeks of dry without failing. She said, "I think I finally know what I'm doing." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother would have loved to hear that." Willa said, "I know." They talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest they had talked in years. The farmers' market in Belfry ran on Saturday mornings from June through October in the parking lot behind the county co-op on Elm Street. Willa had driven past it twice in June, once in July. Noting the configuration, the traffic patterns, the ratio of produce vendors to craft vendors, the way the serious buyers moved through the rows with bags already open and a specific quality of intention. She set up her first table on a Saturday in mid-July. She had loaded the truck the night before a full flat of mortgage lifter tomatoes, deep red and heavy. The kind of tomato that does not photograph well, because photographs cannot convey weight or smell, but that communicates everything necessary the moment you hold one. Dragon tongue beans in 2 varieties, yellow with purple, streaking bundled in quarter-pound portions. Because she had learned from reading Chester's market notes in the back of the journal that presentation mattered not for vanity, but because it was a form of respect for the work. 3 varieties of summer squash. The first of the winter squash, 3 specimens she had picked early to show the variety rather than the volume. She had set up the table by 7:15, and she was sold out of tomatoes by 9:30. She had brought 64 pounds. The man who bought the last flat was not a regular market customer. He introduced himself as the executive chef of a farm-to-table restaurant in Springfield, 40 miles east, that had been looking for a regional tomato supplier for 2 seasons. He held a mortgage lifter in one hand and a dragon tongue bean in the other, and looked at them with the focused attention of a professional evaluating raw material. He asked about her growing practices. She told him no synthetic inputs, deep mulch water retention, 16-year soil program that she had inherited and was continuing. She said she could provide documentation if he needed it for his sourcing disclosures. He looked at the tomato in his hand. He said, "How much of this can you do consistently?" She thought about the cistern. She thought about the East Section's organic matter reading. She thought about Chester's variety notes and the 16 years of data on what this specific ground produced in hot, dry summers. She said, "More than I have today. I'm in the first season." He bought the remaining stock at a price that was 20% above her posted rate. He left her his card and a standing order request for the rest of the season weekly delivery and a conversation about the following spring that was specific enough to function as a commitment without being formalized as one. She thanked him, and he thanked her, and he carried his boxes to a white cargo van with the restaurant name on the side and drove east towards Springfield. She stood behind her empty table for a moment. 3 Giant hang down from her, she became aware of a presence she recognized without looking directly at. Harlow Briggs was standing at the edge of the market with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a coffee cup in his other hand. He was not looking at any of the stalls. He was looking at the space where her table was at the empty crates and the white cargo van pulling out of the lot. She looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he gave a single deliberate nod, the kind that does not require a response, the kind that means I watched, I saw, I know what that was. He turned and walked away through the market without stopping at any other table. She began breaking down her display. Ryland Marsh was not at the Belfry Market that morning. She had noticed his absence the way you notice the absence of a specific weather pattern, not as relief exactly, but as information. He was not there because he did not need to be there. What had happened at that table and in that parking lot and in the season that had produced what was on that table had resolved itself without requiring his witness. The 41 pages in the county records office were still there. The water right was still recorded and senior and enforceable. The cistern was at 40% capacity after the dry stretch refilling now with the July rain. The soil in the east section was what it was 4.7% organic matter, the highest reading in the county. In 30 years, the result of 16 years of work by a man who had kept a notebook and a woman who had built a cistern, and together had laid the foundation for a granddaughter they had prepared for, without ever being certain she would come. None of that required Ryland Marsh to see it to be real. She loaded the truck and drove back on Dillard Road with the windows down, and the morning already warm, and the fields on either side of the road showing the deep green that comes after a soaking rain, the color of a season that has decided to continue. That evening, she sat on the porch with Chester's notebook. She had been avoiding the sealed page at the back for 6 weeks. Not because she was afraid of it, because Chester had written in the second to last entry that she would know when she had earned it. She had taken that seriously. She had been trying to understand what earning it looked like, what condition needed to be met before the moment was right. Sitting on the porch in the July evening with an empty truck and a standing order from a Springfield restaurant, and $4 more in her account than she'd had this morning, and the rain-wet fields stretching out to the east where the creek was running again, she thought, this is probably it. She opened the notebook to the back. The tape had dried to the point where it released without tearing the page, just a soft separation clean, as if it had been waiting to let go. Chester's handwriting. No date. If you are reading this, you stayed through a dry season. I don't mean a season without rain, though, that too. I mean the season when it would have been easier to go. When the offers were on the table, and the account was low, and the neighbors were watching, and the sky was not cooperating. You stayed through that. That is the only qualification that matters for what I am going to tell you. This land is not special because of what it is. It is special because of what was done to it deliberately over a long time by people who were not certain anyone would ever notice. We were not farming for an audience. We were farming for the record, for the proof that a small piece of ground properly attended to builds something that compounds, not just in the soil, in the people who work it. You will find your own reasons to stay. They will be different from mine and different from Hazel's. That is as it should be. The land will teach you what it taught us. It just needs you to be here long enough to listen. One more thing. Below the north ridge inside the cedar stand, there is a flat stone at the base of the largest tree. Lift it. That's all. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she got up and walked across the dark property toward the north ridge, using the flashlight from Hazel's kitchen drawer, following the slope up through the cedars, until she found the largest tree which she knew, because she had walked this ridge enough times now to know each tree by its silhouette against the sky. At its base, half covered in moss, a flat stone approximately the size of a dinner plate. She crouched and lifted it. Beneath it was a small tin, the kind that once held hard candy, sealed with electrical tape. Inside the tin, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, a single photograph. The photograph showed 2 people standing in the east section of the property in what appeared to be late summer, the corn in the south corner, tall behind them, the beds between them in full production. The man was Chester, younger than any image she had seen of him, somewhere in his mid-40s, laughing at something outside the frame. The woman beside him was Hazel, one hand raised against the sun, looking directly into the camera, with an expression that was not quite smiling, but held something better than a smile. The certainty of someone who knows exactly where she is and has chosen to be there. On the back of the photograph, Hazel's handwriting. Recent. The ink not faded. This was our favorite season. We always thought the next one would be better. We were usually right. Willa held the photograph in the beam of the flashlight for a long time. The cedars moved around her in the night wind. Below the ridge, the property lay quiet, the beds and the barn and the farmhouse, with its single porch light burning the fields, stretching out to the creek, and beyond it to the county road and the town and the county and everything else. All of it indifferent to the fact that something specific and real and carefully built was taking root on 14 acres at the end of Dillard Road. She put the photograph in her jacket pocket against her ribs next to where she had carried the oilcloth map on her first day. She did not go back to the house immediately. She sat at the base of the cedar tree and looked out through the gap in the tree line at the east section, below the beds just visible in the dark as darker shapes against the ground. The moisture still in the soil from the long rain. Everything that had been planted, settling deeper into everything that had been built. She thought about Chester writing in his notebook for 16 years. She thought about Hazel building a cistern in the autumn of 1974 and not telling anyone where it was for 50 years. She thought about the $412 tax bill and the $18,400 that had been waiting in a savings account at the Calhoun County Savings Bank, compounding quietly since 1978, and the way Marion had folded the balance slip once before handing it across the counter. The gesture of someone who had been part of a long plan and was satisfied to see it arrive. She thought about Ryland Marsh and his 420 acres and his assessors and his envelopes with clean numbers on clean paper. And she thought about how a man could own 420 acres and still need the thing that sat on someone else's 14. She thought about Harlow Briggs stepping through the gate in the fence line with 50 pounds of compost on his shoulder and no explanation. The kind of help that does not announce itself as help because announcing it would change what it is. She thought about the Springfield chef holding a mortgage lifter tomato in his hand with the attention of someone encountering a thing they did not expect to find in the place they found it. She thought about her grandmother writing, "She will stay in Chester's notebook in the years after he was gone, adding her certainty to his uncertainty, answering a question he had been unable to answer himself." The night was warm, and the fields were quiet, and the season was not finished. She had a standing order to fill by Thursday. She got up, brushed the cedar duff from her jacket, and walked back down the ridge toward the farmhouse where the porch light was burning. There was work to do in the morning. There was always work to do in the morning. That was the thing about good ground. It did not wait.